Sorry about that. I had a little technological glitch, so that's why this lecture is broken up into two different parts. Um, so we talked about the rapid push, and we just barely scratched the surface of that. What does industry, what do the telephones, the typewriters, the industrialization and the invention of that industrial machine age do to the workers? What do they do to the industries? Well, some benefits are going to come out, right? And we look at it and we're going to see telephones and typewriters. Well, less letter writing, more face-to-face conversation, and less ambiguity due to handwriting mix-ups. It is going to create a lot of typewriters, and it's going to create, on the negative side, a cast of female employees whose jobs it is to write these letters, and typists and stenos and all of that. Okay. But we do see a massive increase in communication and record keeping. It's going to be very good for the banking and the insurance industry. Those sweatshops are going to become a benefit to many people because it's going to make, through those sewing machines, it's going to make cheaper clothes. And it's going to make people buy things off the rack. Before, you bought clothes that were custom made. You bought the patterns, you made them to fit, you made them bespoke, or you made them at home. And I don't know when's the last time anybody had any sewing patterns of how to sew a shirt, of how to make all of these different bits and pieces. That was commonplace before. Well, now you're going to start to radically increase the amount of consumer activity because I can go buy clothes off the racks. And of course, we start to crush people with body image issues because we start to standardize the sizes as we go forward. So less custom made, more boxy. We are going to start to see more chain stores popping up, and that's again the upside or the downside of the Industrial Revolution, depending on how you see it. Now, one of the inventions that's going to revolutionize our day-to-day dietary practices is the refrigerator. It changes our shopping practices. It changes their dietary practices. Because now I can go and I can buy food and I can keep it for longer. There's less of a worry about buying and eating spoiled food. Our milk stays better longer. The risk of bovine TB because of drinking spoiled milk goes down. And so we really do see an enormous benefit through electrification and the application of refrigerators. Even cold boxes are going to help us enormously. But because of technology, and I've already mentioned that, whether it's Carnegie or whether it's Rockefeller and Standard Oil, an economy of scale. Today, we would see Walmart, you would see Amazon be able to work on these economies of scale. The technological capital investments needed to compete and needed to buy and produce on large scales. The cost of producing 10 refrigerators are high. The cost per unit is very, very high. The cost of producing 1,000 units of refrigerators go down. 10,000 units goes down even further. So the economies of scale are going to mean that the mom and pop stores will start to fall out of business. I can start to make shoes on set sizes, and I can make 10,000 of them, and I can make them enormously cheaper than the cobbler who's working in a shop who can only produce 10 in a week. The 10 in a week are a higher quality, but at a much greater price. This is more of a democratization of shoes and of clothing and of products. And this is going to feed into our consumer culture that we have here in America. Now, what we are going to do is crush labor with scientific methods. I'm going to optimize the time. I'm going to optimize the work. I'm going to figure out in an hour how many should you be able to do. How many of these widgets should you be able to produce? And I'm going to do tests. I'm going to give you a set amount of materials and a set number of tools, and I'm going to see which tools work better. I'm going to set you up with the optimal environment, and then I'm going to see, okay, you can produce 20 widgets in that hour. That's your standard. Now produce it over a 10 or a 12-hour workday. That is the time, and that is the production rate that ought to be there. through the application of scientific methods. Bethlehem Steel reduces its coal shoveling crew from 600 to 140 by specific motions being tested, with specific shovels being tested. Which shovel has the best ability to get through the coal, the largest capacity to shovel, and you test all of that out and you set a standard, and that's your work production quota. If you don't hit that quota, what happens to you? You get fired. The immigration and the urbanization feeding this industry means that there are more workers waiting for that job. So the moment your production dips, the moment you get hurt, the moment you show up late to work, you're fired, the next one in line. Because you're not a skilled labor anymore. You're not some guy with all of the skills necessary to create a pair of shoes from scratch. You're a guy putting flap A into slot B all day. That's your job, and you're doing it 75 times an hour. You fall behind, you get left behind, and you get fired. And that is significantly going to alter our status of labor. We will create a lot of new jobs, but some sectors are going to see less job because of the mechanization. The jobs we do create are no longer going to be producers. I'm not a shoemaker. I'm a cog in a machine that produces shoes. I'm not an engine builder where I take a block and I take the pistons and I take the heads and I put it all together and I make it work. No. I'm just a guy that screws 4 screws into this engine block as it moves down an assembly line. Okay? You're just a cog in that machine. And that has a significant impact on the way you look at your job, the pride you might take in all of that. And the quality is not a measure of your performance, it is the quantity. Did you produce 100 that were good enough? Yes. That has replaced the independence that you had to produce 10 that were the absolute best. You work to a watch, you work to a whistle. You show up when they tell you to show. You pee when they tell you to pee. You eat your lunch when they tell you to eat your lunch. And you work for the number of hours they tell you to work, or they'll find somebody else. That is the brutal economics of it. And along the way, we're going to find ways to cut costs. We're going to start to put women and kids in low-skilled jobs. And one of the things your textile mills or food processing mills are going to show is that male hands, the larger hands, don't always fit, particularly in textile mills. Women's hands are sometimes smaller, more delicate, and can fit into some of these machines. Say if you have some of your threads that break. You know who fits even better? Kids' hands fit even better. And you know what we have? A lot of kids and women and immigrants that are pouring into the country that are, in industry's eyes, disposable. So from 1880 to 1900, you've got a trebling of the number of women employed. And of course, I pay women significantly less because they're not viewed as the primary breadwinners for their family. Now, of course, we're taking men, the primary breadwinners, out of these jobs and replacing them with someone who's being paid a fraction of that wage. And we still have that gender gap in similar fields today because of that perception. You're also going to see women work in clerical retail sections because for the most part, whether it's typists or women who work cash registers or sales clerks, men, we are shallow creatures. If we're going to go to buy a new suit, we don't want a dude telling us we look good in that suit. We're going to want a young lady that tells us that we look good in that suit. So as consumer society starts to open up, what you'll see is a male manager supervising a sales clerk or clerical jobs. By 1920, about half of the clerical jobs were held by women, and that number is going to continue to go up. It's a cost-saving mechanism, and again, it becomes essential for women to enter the workforce, particularly in these immigrant families, because the wages of our industrial workers are being pressed forever down because of the constant stream of immigrants coming into the country. Children are also going to find their way into the workforce because there's no requirement for kids to go to school. By 1890, we have about 20% of the kids between maybe 10 to 15 of years employed in full-time working. Okay? And it's because in factories, in textile mills, for example, you find a lot of light duty tasks that are ideally suited for children at a fractional wage. Should I pay a man or a woman a high wage to push a broom? No, I can teach a kid to push that broom, and I can pay him a nickel or a quarter an hour. Probably more of a nickel an hour. So we're going to start to see the grinding away at the working classes by industry as they struggle to maximize profits, to make them better, faster, cheaper. And the way that they can save a lot of money is through the destruction of the working classes. Okay? Now, when we look at this, there is no impetus for the newly created industrial machines to be safe. That is not a primary design feature. If I have a press where I'm making fenders for an automobile, I have zero safety mechanisms installed. Right? Hundreds of thousands of industrial workers working in a steel mill, working in a textile mill, working in all of these industries where heavy machines are run. There are no safety precautions because nobody's forced them to make it. And of course, if all I'm doing is taking sheet steel and placing it onto a die that's about to be formed by an industrial press coming down, if my hands are a little slow or I'm a little hungover because I drank too much the night before, which was common in the immigrant world, then they're calling you lefty because you lose your right hand. Worse, as some of these mules and these textile mills go back and forth, the heavy machinery and the carriages that help weave the cloth together, you linger a little too long, you lose fingers. If your head, as you're trying to clean them, stays a little too long, and people's heads are crushed routinely in these industrial accidents. 1913 alone saw 250,000 people dead and over 1 million injured. These are incredibly hazardous working conditions, and you're going to start to see inside these factories, particular to that security measures being put in place that nobody's really thought about. One particular factory, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, okay, they had the doors locked. All of the other emergency exits and all of the other, actually the emergency exits weren't even designed yet. It was just other doors. They had them locked to keep workers from nipping out, from taking a break, from stealing. There was one way in, one way out. And of course, it was a sweatshop. So the risk of fire was incredibly high. And in 1911, that fire pays off. There's a lot of lint. A spark hits it, bang, bursts into flames. This is a tragic coincidence because it is on the 10th floor of a building in downtown Manhattan. The main door, entry, exit that wasn't locked, opens to the inside. So if there's 200 workers trying to get out a door that only opens in, everybody's rushing away from a fire. You can hear the crush trying to get to the door, and then nobody can back up enough to let everybody open the door as it opens inside. Nobody had thought about the design principle of having emergency fire exits that always open out. That's something that next time you go outside an emergency exit, they always open out. That starts to happen at this point. We start to design these buildings with fire escapes, with multiple exits that all, of course, open out. Unfortunately, it takes hundreds of people to die in industrial accidents, thousands of people to die before we start to think about making reforms. And this is going to be a key component in the progressive era that's coming up in the next unit. Now, Triangle becomes a major example because it's downtown Manhattan at 4 o'clock, and you wind up with images. And I'll show you the images. You wind up with images of this is the building up here, and you realize we've got some mechanized down here in the lower left. You've got some mechanized firefighting equipment. They don't have a ladder tall enough to reach the 8th and the 10th floor where the workers are. Fire reform comes out of that. You don't have a way out. And so as people are leaving their offices and going home in downtown Manhattan, women are jumping to their death to escape the fire. And so the headlines, the pictures, the images will feed the progressive era and the need to clean all of this up. Now, as horrible as these conditions are, the wages, the hours, the conditions they're working for is what was worst about the industrial age. And they always argued there's a freedom of contract by the employers. If they don't like the job, they can go get another one, which is true. But it's a nasty convergence of immigration and urbanization that puts so many people there for that job that there is a natural push down of that wage. That if there's an immigrant out that door that'll do it for a penny less an hour than what you're doing it for, they might as well hire that guy because you're not skilled. Capitalists even today will talk about this freedom of contract, how the natural wage will be found, that natural wage affordable will be found by supply and demand and then market forces. Well, it doesn't always apply when external forces are going to keep those things down. Because labor is being crushed, the natural reaction to that is going to be violence and trade unionism. Okay? And the layering isn't working 100% well, but we'll just roll with it. Now, trade unions, unionist activity, and all of this had been around from the early 1800s, and union ideas are coming in and being imported from Europe, particularly Britain. The 1870s, 1880s, we're going to see an uptick in trade union activity. As America industrializes, those conditions are going to lead those workers to try to organize. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of isms out there in the world. The only ism that America is really comfortable with in the 1870s is capitalism, and Americanism, unionism, socialism, communism, anarchism. They're all isms, and every American still views them as bad. And even as these socialist ideas are talked about today, you know, we still have socialism that a lot of the Republican Party will still say, you know, America's not a socialist country. I beg to differ, but we are a very, very conservative socialist nation, but we are moving in that direction. In the 1870s, trade unions are evil, okay? And at least the general perception of it, because they get associated with violence, with discord. And the anarchists and the communists and the socialists really start to use tactical violence. And the association in everybody's mind is that you're a trades unionman, you're an anarchist. You're there to burn down the capitalist system, and you're anti-American. That association becomes very, very strong. The National Labor Union in 1866 did have over 500,000 members, but in economic hard time, trade unionism falls apart, and the Panic of 1873 forced a lot of members to leave, and that activity collapses. Okay? Now, that economic downturn, we'll see layoffs, we'll see increased hours, decreased wages. By the 1870s, 1877 in particular, the railroads are going on strike. Okay? They start to attack property, derailing trains, burning yards, sabotaging lines. The state militias are sent in to break the striking lines, and they just indiscreetly start firing into rioting, strike breaking, or striking crowds. using violence to put new workers onto those lines, breaking the strike, or what unionist men would call scabs, men that are there to fill that job, crossing the picket line of men who are protesting and striking. In Pittsburgh, the state police, they bayonet the strikers. I mean, they used rifles and bayonets, and they killed 10 labor unionist men, which of course the mob is incensed by that. They destroy buildings and turn over freight cars, and a certain number of the state troops are trapped in a roundhouse, which is a way to turn around and give a U-turn to a locomotive. They have to shoot their way out, killing 20 more just to save their own lives. This type of violence is inherent, and of course the federal government is going to side on the side of business. Rutherford B. Hayes sends federal troops to protect business against the workers. Right? This trend is going to continue as we move forward. Right? Now, you'll see in the 1880s, you'll see more riots in Chicago, the Haymarket riots. This becomes a turning point. Because in the 1880s, we've got new kinds of immigrants coming in. We've got Italian, we've got Slavic, we've got Eastern European immigrants coming into the country. And the perception is that they're bringing these radical new ideas, these violent new ideas. Okay? Not entirely untrue. But the Haymarket riots, they start out relatively peacefully. They are protesting for what seems like a radical idea at the time, but today it's hard to imagine. All they want is an 8-hour workday, away from the 10 to 12-hour workday. The police are mobilized for the potential for extreme violence around May 1st or May Day. This has traditionally been associated, ever since there was an industrial age, May 1st has been associated with the workers' holiday. Right? They still see a good amount of violence and protests over in Europe. The May 1st riots are less of an idea here, at least at this time. So the police were out in force for these 3 days of violence. By May 3rd, there are workers and strikebreakers fighting it out in the street. 2 unionist men are killed by policemen and several wounded. The next night, the protesters gather to protest police brutality, and a bomb, an IED, goes off right as the police start to arrive to break up that demonstration. 7 are killed, 77 more injured. At this point, you just start arresting anyone with a unionist, socialist, anarchist. If there's an ist at the end of their political belief, bang, they get arrested. Okay? 8 anarchists are convicted of offenses. 4 of them are executed. An additional one commits suicide while in jail. If you're an anarchist, there is a big black mark on your back, and they're out to get you. And in the media, anarchism, socialism, unionism, it's all the same ism, and it's all bad. Anything that is anti-American, anti-capitalist is labeled bad. Another one of the very famous incidents of striking violence happens around George Pullman and his company that makes sleeper cars. Okay? Now, Pullman had a factory where he basically set the standard for the sleeper cars that went on pretty much every railroad and rail line out there in the United States. The economic hard times of the panic of 1894 or 1893 hit. He cuts wages, 25 to 40% in his factory. Now, what he has in his factory, near his mill, near a coal seam, was a factory town, and everybody that worked in that factory lived in that town. It's not surprising that he owned all of the stores and he rented all the houses. So while he is cutting the wages to every one of his workers, he's not reducing the prices and he's not reducing the rents. And essentially, he's cutting their wages and having all the other prices remain the same. This is when a labor unionist and socialist champion named Eugene V. Debs, who was at that time head of the American Railway Union, they call for a strike across the whole of the rail industry. They call for a strike that refuses to handle any cars that have a Pullman car on it. And at this point, every train in America had in one form or another a Pullman car. Right? 1890, Grover Cleveland, as your president, calls in the troops to break the strike, ostensibly for the security of the United States mail, because they traveled on those cars. We've got to protect the mail. So that shows you where government is going to land when it comes to trade unionism. Now, there are a lot of different unions that are out there, some espousing radical ideology, like the Knights of Labor and Terrence Powderly up there at the top. It's a darn fine mustache he's working with there. I am envious. Now, for Powderly and the Knights of Labor, they didn't care who you were. Skilled, unskilled, we represent labor. And for them, they followed the teachings of Marxist dogma. They wanted to build a workers' alliance, alternative to capitalism, that they wanted labor to own and operate mines and factories. They wanted to burn down the capitalist thing, not necessarily calling for violence like Marx did in that, that Communist Manifesto, but this certainly is an incredibly radical idea to the American ideology of capitalism. Now, the Knights of Labor are going to have a significant number of members by 1886. And that's the scary labor union. Skilled, unskilled labor of all kinds that's trying to form a class identity for us that isn't always as successful in America than it is in some other European countries. Now, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, that is trying to bring skilled workers into a union. And that's where the AFL brings in something completely different. They're not interested in unskilled laborers. They bring prices down. And particularly, they shunned them from their union because they saw the unskilled workers as the ones that are driving industrial wages down. They wanted skilled workers. They wanted tradesmen. And they're not talking about pie in the sky Marxist ideology. You know what they wanted? They wanted to work less hours. They wanted to get more money. They wanted the right to collectively bargain for salaries and pension and those kind of things. And consequently, they see significant amounts of numbers, and they actually still exist today. The AFL merged with the CIO, and if you hear labor discussions and talks, the AFL-CIO is still out there negotiating for skilled workers. Now, they will actively exclude women and minorities and immigrants as they see as lowering the wages. Now, that ideology does sound relatively familiar even to our ideas, stuff that's coming out of one side of the political spectrum today. Okay. Now, AFL represents the more pragmatic labor unionist idea, the less scary, the less anarchical, the less violent. On the other end of that scale, after and picking up on the tradition of the Knights of Labor, it was our good man down there at the bottom, Eugene V. Debs, and the International Workers of the World, the IWW. Now, these guys are the inheritors of and the expanders of the Knights of Labor. They're not only talking about the workers' ownership of the means of production, they're talking about the use of tactical violence, i.e. bombs and sabotage, to deliver those ends. They get the majority of the publicity. They really only have a fraction of the numbers, but people don't necessarily differentiate between the AFL and the IWW. In the media's minds, they're all the same, and they're all responsible for Haymarket. They're all responsible for Pullman. They're all responsible for everything. And the subtle gradations of what a union wants and the realistic goals versus the media-driven hysteria of it is difficult to try to ascertain. Now, some of those ideas should sound familiar given current events. Now, the unions are going to continue to draw that attention, and it's the radical IWW that draws the attention and the fears of these new immigrants bringing the socialist and the anarchist ideas in. And then there's a strong push for law and order. Send in the military, send in the troops, send in the police. You know, if you need to, shoot them. What we need is law and order. These people are coming to America and trying to burn down the capitalist system. We need them under control. There's a large amount of headlines with it. You know, the reality of the unionist idea is that in 1900, maybe 1 million out of 27 million were in unions. By 1920, that's up, but maybe less than 15% of the workforce. For most of the people, if you get a good job, you do everything you can to keep it. Because this is an unregulated economy, and you've heard me mention it. There was a depression in 1857. There's going to be an economic depression in 1873. There's a panic of 1893. You know, this type of boom and bust roller coaster, it makes your employment very, very tenuous. So a lot of people simply don't want to rock the boat, because if you get your job and you can keep it, you know, you can enjoy a significant uptick in your standard of living. Industrialization is going to make the world a smaller place, whether it's the telegraph, the telephone, the railway, the U.S. mail, steamships crossing the ocean in 10 to 6 or 7 days. You know, those things are going to make the world a much smaller place. And of course, I'm going to have possibly at this time the greatest disparity of the haves and have-nots than ever before in history, but also new products coming in. Argentinian beef, Australian lamb, Russian wheat. All of these things are coming into our country and making the overall cost of living go down in some factors, but our consumerist society is going to see the things that we need to purchase go up. Okay? Our wages are not going up. That means women, children go into the workforce. If we've got a spare room, we rent it out. More people in the workforce, less of an adolescent, less of a childhood. You know, you're 5 years old, you're out there scrapping and scraping, hoping to get a few pennies or a couple of nickels each week to help your family get by. And no matter what the improvements in terms of cost of day-to-day items, the overall cost of living is up. Wages no longer going up. In fact, sometimes they're being forced down. But you could look forward to living a little bit longer. New things are going to start to kill you. Typhoid, tuberculosis, influenza, outside of the 1918 pandemic, those deaths are down. Diphtheria, down. Smallpox not killing you. Cholera not killing you. You know, none of that is killing you. What we are going to do, we're going to find new things to kill you. Cancer. You eat enough adulterated food, high sugars, you get diabetic. Processed foods, diabetes. Beef put on the menu, heart disease skyrockets. And we're starting to live longer to the point that cancer will become a major, major factor. Now, automobile-related deaths, that's going to start to spike. Homicides are going to start to spike because of urbanized living. We're living a little bit longer, and new and more creative ways to die are being invented or are being found. Okay. Now, if you can afford them, your life gets safer and gets cleaner. Your food gets safer and is better prepared. Flushable toilets. Tin cans makes food preservable. Safe. Refrigeration means you can keep things in your house longer. And of course, we're going to begin our consumer society. What you need to do is buy the electric goods. You need an electric iron. You need an electric refrigerator. You can get an electric stove, which means gas is no longer, or fire is no longer necessary for cooking. These are not time-saving devices. These are labor-saving devices at times, but not time-saving. And as we start to sell some of these things in department stores like Macy's, Wanamaker's, Marshall Field's, we realize the Victorian ethos of the 1800s goes away. Gone are the corsets. Less restrictive, less full clothing. You don't need a bustle any longer. And you start to make national stores. The first nationwide grocery store opens in 1859. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the A&P. And you may have seen it in a few old movies. You go down to the A&P. It's the same thing as saying HEB today. They had 14,000 stores nationwide in 1925. They're selling the same brands across the nation. Clothing, selling the same clothing brands and styles. This is a homogenization of America. And we're going to start to brand it. We're going to start to advertise it. We're going to start to sell it. And when we become a recognizable name, you trademark it. We put it in ads. We put it in billboards. We put it in neon that go blink, blink, blinkety, blink to tell you what you need to buy. We're going to start selling you in the 20s the American dream. So the companies are going to work very hard to try to apply the scientific principles to help survive the boom and bust. That's the problem. I need to be big enough to outlast the bad times. And that's the ebbs and flows of it all. You need to either control it from start to finish in a vertical monopoly. I need to have the oil wells. I need to have the refineries. I need to own the gas stations. I need to own the pumps that pump, from start to finish. Or you need to be like U.S. Steel that controls 3/5 of the world's steel production, or of the U.S.'s steel production. That was the answer. And so we start to see corporate organization. We're going to allow laws and limited liability corporations to encourage business. And these are your Republican policies that we talk about today, that you limit the liability of a corporation to its company assets, not to the personal assets of the person who starts that company. Anyone could start a company, market it, sell it, put stock on the market, and not lose everything they owned personally if the company went bankrupt. Now this opens up the world to these charlatans and these scam artists who create a buzz about a company, sell a whole bunch of stock, and then it goes bust. That still happens even today. But on the Republican side of our political thinking, LLCs is a core value of the entrepreneurial principle, that they're able to then go and innovate and start new businesses without the fear of losing all of their private holdings if it goes bust. So we're going to have a lot of corporate organizational laws set forward. Pools are simply where all of the bourbon whiskey producers come together in a pool to decide whether it's railway or steel, that they decide this is how much we're producing, these are the prices we're going to set, this is the profit that we're all going to take. And it's dependent a little bit on the honesty of all of the different producers. Easy to maintain in the good times. Really hard to maintain a pool during lean times. Now, what you need to think about, that's in the company's organizational benefit. Is it in the individual consumer's interest to see pools out there? Decidedly not. So while this is proliferating right now, we're going to see a backlash when we get to the industrial age, in the progressive age, to what's happening right now. So another organization is we're going to see trusts, and these are again organizational structures of companies that allow you to get around some of the limited incorporated laws in some states. Say a state like Texas only allows companies incorporated in Texas to operate in Texas. Well, you could set up a trust that would control companies that are incorporated in Texas, and one in Louisiana, and one in Oklahoma, and one in Arkansas. That way, your reach of your company could overcome the limitation of its incorporating status. And that stock in that company would be yielded up to a trust in that board of directors or trustees. Trusts still hold out and still are around today. It was just that simple response to the limitations of incorporation laws. And some states will set up incorporation laws that are very liberal for certain industries. Some will set them up where they're very strict for other industries. And that's why you'll see certain states become hubs for industries. The insurance industry, either in Nebraska or in Connecticut. And you've seen a lot of that throughout the years. It's becoming less likely today, but was prevalent for a long time. Another thing is another form of getting around the incorporation laws is the use of holding companies. And the prime example of that was New Jersey. And in 1988, New Jersey allowed corporations chartered in New Jersey to own stock in companies and other corporations in other states. And so Standard Oil of New Jersey merged 40 different refineries across the United States in a holding company so that Standard Oil could control 90% of the refining capacity in America. Okay? Now, all of these holding companies, their goal was that vertical monopoly. And all the while, the moment you create a corporation and you sell stock in it is the moment you have stock speculation. And we'll continue to highlight this, that the New York Stock Exchange in 1886 is selling 1 million shares a day. And a number of these holding companies and a number of these corporations have their stock traded. 1869 saw 145 companies traded. That is up to 511 by 1914. Savings banks, foreign governments are all investing heavily in this market, leading to the volatility of the markets and leading to the volatility of the American economy. And of course, we know what's coming in the 1920s. We know that there is a crash coming. You know, we've had these crashes before. We've had these downturns before. And of course, we continue to hold them and have them as we go forward. Now, within industry, there's going to be some social ideas that are going to be put out there. Okay, the Darwinistic principles are going to start to filter their way, advocated by Herbert Spencer. And social Darwinism is the evolutionary idea of those who should have power and wealth. Society and nature will naturally evolve that, and it will gravitate towards them in almost an evolutionary process. That power is wielded and wealth is wielded by those who are best to wield it. It also gets applied to corporations in the fact that only the strongest will survive, the biggest, the most adept, evolutionarily strongest will survive based on this Darwinian principle. And that wealth, power, whether it's corporations or individuals, will have that power flow to them because they're the ones that, whether God or Yahweh or whomever, nature, has endowed them with those sort of powers. That Darwinistic idea is going to be very influential in American ideology early on. Teddy Roosevelt in particular, very, very keen on these ideas. Now, another idea, the gospel of wealth, picked up by Carnegie in particular, in that you are, whether it's Darwinistically or evolutionarily, endowed with wealth and power, you have obligations. to serve society in humane ways as a result of that wealth, that power being flown towards you. Now, Carnegie doesn't believe in the handouts or in the social welfare programs. What he believes is shaping of culture and society through donations and endowments and museums and orchestras and universities and libraries. His family were probably greatly aggrieved when, out of that 500 million he made from the sale of Bethlehem Steel, he sent 350 of it to various philanthropical endowments that still bear his name, and universities that still bear his name. Others are simply going to call upon the government to assist businesses in the terms of loans, subsidies, tariffs, and tax relief. Protect American industry, protect American products through subsidies, through tariffs, and of course, a very limited tax relief on the subsidies and the import and excise duties that would make American businesses more productive. That Republican ideology is still going to continue on even today. Meanwhile, people are calling upon the government to protect the populace, the consumers, from the predatory corporations that are out there. States start to take the lead in it. By 1900, forbidding and outlawing pools, certain provisions in their state constitutions against trusts operating in their states. Well, the simple solution to that is going to be that we just use holding companies, and we just will incorporate it, and we will just use a holding company rather than a trust. It becomes almost a great game. You outlaw something, we'll do something else until you figure out what we're doing, and then we'll do something else until you figure out how we're doing that. And so many of the people in the South are the ones that are working against these trusts and pools. And this is where you're going to see the origins of populism and of progressivism out in the South and the West, that anti-business, anti-industry idea that the farmers and the ranchers and the working classes are being crushed by the same forces. And so they start to evolve in that process. Now, you'll see the 1890 Congress taking the lead with a Sherman Antitrust Act passed that prohibited conspiracies and restraint of trade. And that labeled out fines and jail terms and punitive damages and triple damages for offenders. Now, the intent of the legislation was to prohibit trusts and pools that limited or that operated in a monopolistic way. But you didn't necessarily define restraint of trade. What could constitute restraint of trade is left rather up in the air. And the United States goes against the E.C. Knight and Company over sugar refining. Now, they controlled 98% of the country's refined sugar. Right? Now, when the Supreme Court rules on this case and on this antitrust case, they say control of production didn't necessarily mean control of trade, and they also said that it doesn't fall under the powers of the Sherman Antitrust Act because Knight Company worked entirely within Pennsylvania. Government is firmly on the side of big business, and that's what makes this the Gilded Age. That's what makes this that golden and glittering, shining object on the outside, but on the inside it's just base, corrupt, and pot metal. It looks shiny, but it's really just kind of cheap and corroded. And it's the heyday of the political cartoonists, and here you have big businesses, whether it is Standard Oil, whether it is the coal or the ice or the sugar or the railroad trusts or the steel trusts, defecating upon the Senate and preying upon the American populace. Nevertheless, the Horatio Alger myth is going to be strong. Here you have From Farm Boy to Senator up there, and the Luck and Pluck series. It is published by Horatio Alger. They're selling the American dream, but you're working 60 hours a week. You know, your wage per hour, it's up, but the cost of living is up. The nation's a smaller place because of the railroads and the telegraphs and the telephones, but Horatio Alger may be alive and well, but also in the bottom right, you see Standard Oil as this great monolith that has the power to consume Congress, the White House, and the whole of the nation in its grips. And that's what we really need to worry about, and that's the problem that we need to determine. And as it churns up and as it breaks up our political landscapes and crowds our cities and pollutes our cities, the response to industrialization is going to be the need for reform, reform of corporate behavior, reform of industrial safety, reform in so many different ways that we will address when we get to the next unit and the progressive era. Okay, that's it for this time. Next time we'll address the great American melting pot of immigration and an urbanization that will drive the industrial age as we go forward.